Today we're going to be discussing some of the forms that are included in your charge conference package that will be approved at charge conference for each individual church. The forms we're going to be talking about are, number one, and most importantly, the pastor support worksheet and related forms for accountable reimbursed expenses for the pastors and their housing allowance resolution form, which tie into the pastor support worksheet. The forms are available on the conference website, and I have the page open that you will arrive at if you type in 2015 cc forms.holston.org in the URL field as indicated by the cursor on the screen. Once you arrive at this screen, you will see 2015 Annual Conference Reimbursement as the first item, and as you scroll on down, you will arrive at form number 05, which is the Pastor Support Worksheet. You can open that on your desktop and save it to work with later. On down through the available forms, 06 form is the Accountable Expense form. You can download that as well. And then Form 8, Minister's Housing Allowance Resolution. All three of these forms need to be downloaded and saved to your desktop for future use so that you can work with locally. Looking at the forms individually, the first form we'll look at is the Pastor Support Worksheet. I encourage everyone and even require that everyone use these download forms so that everyone is using the same form throughout the conference. 2016 Pastor Support Worksheet should be identified as the effective date of January 1st, 2016. You would fill in the district name, the pastor's name, first and last, and please include the last four digits of the pastor's Social Security number. This is important for later use by conference staff so that we can get to the right person if there are questions concerning an individual by name only. The charge is the name of the charge as identified in the appointment book from annual conference. The individual churches, if it is a multi-point charge, would be listed under Church A, Church B, C, D, E, F, etc. Please put the lead church as Church A of a multi-point charge. The appointment code is taken from those codes available here at the bottom of the Pastor Support Worksheet and identify the status the clergy person has with the conference. Full-time, three-quarter time, half-time, and quarter time do not represent the amount of time actually spent by the pastor in performance of their duties, but is a function of their line 4 compensation relative to minimum compensation, which is identified on page 2, where you see minimum compensation for full-time clergy. And in this case, where full elders and full deacons, the minimum comp is $40,184. So if you had a full elder working for compensation less than $40,184, you would determine what that percentage was, and it would go in this area right here. And you can notice the notation here, service time is a percentage of minimum salary and is used to determine benefit eligibility. All right, having completed the top part of the form, then we get into the first section of the form, which is base compensation, base taxable compensation. Line 1 is the local church salary, and if it's a multi-point charge, you would list these items individually under the respective churches identified in this section up here. This is an Excel form, so if you filled in on line 1 for A, B, and C, the total would automatically total under this column right here. So for example, if we entered $20,000 for Church A, $15,000 for Church B, and $10,000 for Church C, you would see that the sum of those automatically calculates over in the total column. If your charge has a conference salary supplement to supplement line 1, that would be entered again by the respective churches on line 2. And here again, this totals to line under the total column. Other benefits paid for the pastor. If the charge is paying for the pastor their share of their insurance premiums, you would include those amounts on line 3A. Now, I need to emphasize, this doesn't mean that you're taking that money out of their salary and sending it in on direct billing. This means that the charge is actually paying these amounts for the pastor as additional compensation. The same would be true if they are paying utilities, Social Security, or any other benefits that are being paid for the clergy. Moving to the reimbursable expense section on line 5, you would enter anything that the churches are going to pay towards the pastor's continuing education expense, for attendance at seminars, and in the case of a local pastor going through course of study, anything that the church is paying for the pastor for that would also go on this line 5. The pastor's annual conference expense are those expenses incurred by the pastor in attending annual conference, and any other vouchered travel or professional expenses, mileage reimbursement traveling to and from conference events, but not any travel time or travel expense, mileage expense for commuting to and from their residence to the church. That is not considered a reimbursable expense. Need to emphasize in this section that these expenses need to be submitted to the financial secretary or the church treasurer or whoever is authorizing the reimbursement. So they need to submit paid receipts for anything reimbursed in this section. Any funds that are designated at the beginning of the year that are not used by the pastor are not paid to the pastor, but revert back to the church's budget. Anything unused, the pastor loses. You have to submit valid paid receipts in order to be reimbursed. Those expenses are totaled on line 8. Accountable expense reimbursement policy. This form needs to be completed, and the amount at the bottom of the page will tie back to the amount that appears on line 8 of the pastor support worksheet. Line 9 is a combination of line 4 and line 8, and that total would appear on line 9. Also notice that if the individual churches in a multi-point charge are sharing in these reimbursable expenses, they would be identified in the columns under the respective churches. Quite often the lead church or the larger churches in multi-point charges would be responsible for covering the pastor's reimbursable expenses, but that is purely up to the churches within the charge as they would reach agreement on how those are going to be handled. Line 9 is the combination of line 4, cash compensation, and the reimbursable expenses to determine a total for those two items. The next section is housing. If the clergy person is in a parsonage provided by the charge, then the item on line 10 is used, and it is 25% of the line 4 amount. If there's no parsonage available and a cash housing allowance is paid to the pastor, that appears on line 11. Cash paid to the pastor for housing does not appear on line 10, but on line 11. Line 12 is called pension plan compensation, and it is the combination of line 4 and line 10 or line 11. Line 12 total is used to calculate the direct billing amount to the charge, which is billed to the churches every month by the conference. On line 12A, that calculation appears and is 16.3%, will appear on line 12A, 16.3% of line 12. Line 13 is the pastor's annual UNPIP contribution, and the conference recommends a 3% minimum of the line 12 amount be designated by the pastor to go into their UNPIP account. Line 14 is simply 1/12 of line 13 and is the amount that the charge will be billed by the General Board of Pensions each month. This amount is to be withheld from the pastor's base pay and remitted to the General Board of Pension when the billing is received. That moves into the final section called Information for Payroll and Accounting. Line 15 is the housing allowance resolution approved by the charge conference. This has no relationship with the housing up in the housing compensation section. But line 15 is simply an amount designated by the clergy person to be excluded from their taxable income for income tax purposes. Line 15 is reflected by what is provided on the minister's housing allowance resolution form. This is a form that is completed for charge conference and shows two sections: church-provided housing, and says, therefore be it resolved that the board designates for the charge the amount of X number of dollars for 2016 as a housing allowance for the clergy person and gives the address. If the minister provides their housing, have the same resolution, and you designate an amount that the clergy person is designating to be excluded from income tax purposes, and again shows the residence. This is signed, dated, and all the signatures are affixed here from the charge conference. Going back to the pastor support worksheet, continuing on down on line 16, tax deferred contributions to the UNPIP account. This will be the same amount that appears on line 13. This is the deduction from the pastor's gross salary to arrive at their net pay. Line 17 is the amount of the personal share of the pastor's Blue Cross Blue Shield health premiums that are billed on direct billing. Even if the church is paying the pastor's share of Blue Cross Blue Shield premiums and is included on line 3A of the worksheet, you would also include that same amount on line 17. Up on 3A, you're adding it into his or her base compensation. On line 17, you're reflecting that that amount is being withheld from his or her gross pay. Line 17A are contributions for the pastor's medical reimbursement accounts. Those are the flexible spending accounts, or health savings account contributions if the pastor has elected to be under the health savings account insurance option. Line 18 are contributions to be withheld from the pastor's gross pay for amounts that have been designated to go into dependent care expense reimbursements. Line 19 is the total that will appear on the pastor's W-2 form for the year on line 1 of the W-2 form. That amount, as it states on that line description, is line 4 plus line 11, less any amounts that are included on lines 15, 16, 17, 17A, and 18. This is purely an internal section used by the local church in preparing those documents at year end and helping to determine the net pay of the clergy person. I must emphasize at this point that the pastor support worksheet is not a form that generates any action on the part of the conference except for the calculation of the direct billing amounts that appear on line 12A. It is not intended to be used to either enroll in a health plan, a flexible spending account, or any of the benefit plans, nor is it intended to be used to enroll with the General Board of Pensions. Those are separate enrollment forms that must be completed by the clergy person. This simply is a recap of other actions that have been taking place. The form is prepared by the staff pastor-parish relations committee in coordination with the pastor and with input from the district superintendent. I know we've covered quite a bit of information, and I've moved rapidly through this form. I'll be glad to answer specific questions either in person, or you can contact me by phone at the conference center at 865-293-4136, or you can email me at kenluton@holston.org.